Donald Trump, he is taking the stand in his family's New York civil fraud trial today.
Trump is the first U.S. president to testify as a defendant in a court trial in more than 100 years. The former president is accused of inflating his wealth and property values to get favorable loan and insurance terms. The judge in this case already found Trump and others liable for fraud earlier this year. This trial centers on other allegations, including falsifications of business records, conspiracy, and insurance fraud.
Before entering the courtroom, in the pictures you were just seeing, Mr. Trump denied wrongdoing and took the opportunity to attack the New York Attorney General. She had a response ready even before he opened his mouth.
It's a terrible, terrible thing. These are political operatives that I'm going to be dealing with right now. You have a racist Attorney General who made some terrible statements, and we just see some more that came over the wires today. It's a very sad situation for our country.
At the end of the day, the only thing that matters are the facts and the numbers. And numbers, my friends, don't lie.
Welcome back to the show. John here as always. Under oath in a New York courtroom, Trump exploded at the judge, yelling and pointing fingers in a high-stakes civil fraud trial that could cost him hundreds of millions. The judge warned, this is not a political rally, but Trump kept railing against the proceeding, turning the courtroom into a spectacle of defiance. This is not an isolated incident. This is a pattern that has been building for years, across multiple courtrooms and multiple cases. Trump has a documented history of catastrophic hearings where he loses control completely, unleashing verbal attacks on judges who are simply trying to do their jobs. The civil fraud trial in New York is the most dramatic example, but it is far from the only one.
CBS News chief election and campaign correspondent Robert Costa joins us now from outside the courthouse in New York City. Bob, a historic moment. Can you walk us through Trump's testimony so far?
It's good to be with both of you. I was inside the courthouse today watching this testimony unfold, and it's clear that former President Trump is very defensive about the valuations of his properties over the years. In fact, he testified under oath repeatedly today that he believes properties like 40 Wall Street here in New York, or Doral, his golf course in Florida, or Mar-a-Lago, his estate in Palm Beach, that these are properties that are undervalued, in his view, by his own accountants and his financial statements. The judge in this case, Judge Engoron, however, was visibly frustrated with Trump repeatedly during the course of his testimony, urging Trump's lawyers to get their client, to get the witness in line, to say yes or no to yes or no questions. And at one point, Judge Engoron warned Trump's legal team that if Trump did not change his conduct in the courtroom in terms of how he answered questions, he would have, quote, negative inferences.
There have been angry clashes over presidential immunity claims. There have been contentious shutdown fights. There have been moments where Trump stormed out of proceedings or screamed about witch hunts. And in every single instance, the pattern is the same. Trump explodes, judges respond with warnings, fines, and gag orders. And Trump's behavior makes his legal situation worse, not better. The self-sabotage is consistent and unmistakable. The New York civil fraud trial, brought by Attorney General Letitia James, is where this pattern has been most fully documented. The case alleged that Trump inflated asset values to obtain favorable loans, a fraud that could result in massive financial penalties.
When it came to the scope of the penalty in this ongoing civil case.
Well, Bob, he might have negative inferences in that courtroom, speaking as a judge, but talking to voters and polling voters, they seem to be inferring other things about the former president, and a lot of them like what they see. In fact, according to a new CBS News poll, former President Trump is leading President Biden in the 2024 presidential race if it were to happen today. So the question then becomes, what impact, if at all, will this trial have on those numbers? By the looks of it, it's only helping the former president.
Well, it could be helping in the sense of consolidating Trump supporters around him, especially if they were having the potential to flirt with other candidates politically in this Republican presidential primary race. At the same time, as you know so well, it's very early in the presidential race. We're a year out. It was a year out on Sunday. Polls can only tell you so much. They're indicative a bit of sometimes where the public sentiment is on certain issues. But at the same time, Trump is facing not just this ongoing civil case, but 4 other cases that loom over his own.
When Trump took the witness stand to testify in his own defense, he did not simply answer questions. He erupted. He yelled at Justice Arthur Engoron, pointing his finger aggressively and making accusations that turned the proceedings upside down. He called the judge the fraud, projecting his own legal problems onto the very person who would decide his fate. This was not a calculated legal strategy. This was a loss of control that played out in front of the entire country, with reporters documenting every moment. Justice Engoron had seen this behavior before. In prior hearings, he had already fined Trump for violating gag orders that were designed to prevent precisely this kind of outburst. He had warned that more serious consequences would follow if Trump could not control himself.
Revival campaign, running for the presidency again, a case in Georgia, a criminal case on his handling of classified records, and another one on the federal level with the special counsel investigating January 6th. And then there's one, Tony, just down the street here in New York, investigating those hush money payments to Stormy Daniels.
You know, Bob, those numbers, the polling numbers that Tony was just going over reflect what would happen were the election to take place right now and if former President Donald Trump were the candidate against President Joe Biden. But are any of the cases that you just mentioned potentially disqualifying for the former president? That's
a great point. There is some hesitation in the Republican ranks about what this would all mean for the Republican Party to have a convicted nominee, to have someone who had actually been convicted by a judge or jury. At this point, it's very possible. This is different than a criminal case because it's a judge is making a decision here on a civil level. Trump will certainly appeal the decision whenever it comes down in the coming months. Well, we're at a fluid moment in the presidential cycle. Democrats over the weekend, as these new polling numbers emerged, started to have some more public debate.
And now, in the middle of the trial itself, Engoron had to issue a new warning. He told Trump, in terms that could not be misunderstood, that this was not a campaign rally. He instructed him to simply answer the questions. It was a direct and unmistakable rebuke delivered in front of the entire courtroom. And Trump's response was to ignore it completely. This is where the pattern becomes unmistakable. Reporters in the courtroom described Trump yelling at the judge for a several-minute stretch. They described him railing against a proceeding he claimed was rigged. They described him disregarding repeated attempts by the court and even his own lawyers to calm him down.
About President Biden's standing, about whether he should be the nominee, and Republicans continue to have some consternation, at least in some quarters, about Trump's ability to win.
Robert Costa flashing some of the insight you can expect during the whole 2024 campaign and flashing some of that swag that CBS is putting out for. I see that jacket. First cold day. America Decides. Campaign 2024.
Right. We're already putting in our requests. Where is mine?
Looking good. Robert Costa, thank you very much.
Thank you, Bob.
Mike.
Well, John C. Coffey joins us now. He's a professor at Columbia Law School who specializes in white-collar crime. He's also the director of Columbia University's Center on Corporate Governance. Thanks so much for joining us this afternoon. We know that the former president clashed with the judge while testifying today, as we just heard from Robert Costa. How important is the testimony to the ultimate outcome of this case?
Well, look at it this way. It's less important what Donald Trump says than how he says it. If he angers the judge, possibly gets a contempt penalty, or gets the judge to be even sterner in his proposed relief.
His own legal team, the people paid to defend him, could not get him to stop. They watched as their client systematically undermined his own case through sheer inability to control his temper. And they could do nothing about it because Trump would not listen to anyone. The history of Engoron's interactions with Trump is instructive. Before this trial even began, Engoron had already imposed fines on Trump for violating gag orders designed to prevent attacks on court staff and witnesses. He had threatened more serious consequences, including potential jail time for contempt if the behavior continued. He had already characterized Trump's courtroom conduct as turning the proceedings into a campaign stage rather than a legal hearing. And despite all of these warnings, despite the clear and escalating consequences, Trump could not help himself. The pattern of explosion and response was already well established, and it continued exactly as predicted. The judge's characterization of the courtroom as a campaign stage captures something essential about Trump's approach to legal proceedings. He treats them as if they are rallies, opportunities to perform for his base, rather than serious legal forums where the rules actually matter. He acts as if the cameras are there to capture his political rhetoric, rather than to document a legal proceeding. He behaves as if the judge is just another opponent to be attacked, rather than an authority to be respected. And this fundamental misunderstanding of what courts actually are, this inability to distinguish between a courtroom and a campaign event, is at the heart of his catastrophic hearing pattern. Now, let's talk about what happens when Trump's courtroom behavior meets the broader political environment in which it occurs. It is not just that Trump has meltdowns in court. It is that those meltdowns happen in a context where his public attacks on judges have very real consequences outside the courtroom. Major news organizations like NBC and Reuters have separately documented how judges who rule against Trump have faced harassment and threats. Some have reported changed routines and security upgrades, living under the shadow of threats made possible by Trump's inflammatory rhetoric. This is not theoretical. This is real life. Judges have had to adjust their lives, their schedules, their security arrangements because of the environment Trump has helped create. The connection between Trump's courtroom outbursts and the harassment of judges is direct and undeniable. When Trump attacks a judge publicly, when he calls them biased or corrupt or part of a rigged system, he is not just expressing frustration. He is sending a signal to his supporters. He is telling them that the judge is an enemy, a target, someone who deserves hostility. And some of those supporters respond exactly as he has implicitly encouraged them to. They send threats. They make harassing phone calls. They show up at courthouses. They do things that force judges to change their routines, to upgrade their security, to worry about their families. Trump has never explicitly told anyone to harass a judge, but he has created an environment where harassing judges is a predictable outcome of his behavior. And that is a distinction without a difference. The reporting from NBC and Reuters on this issue is damning. They have documented multiple judges who, after ruling against Trump, faced a wave of harassment and threats. These are not rogue activists acting on their own. These are people responding to the climate Trump has created, the permission structure he has established through his constant attacks on the judiciary. The judges who have been targeted have had to change their lives in ways that are deeply troubling for anyone who believes in judicial independence. They have had to think about their safety in ways that judges should never have to think about their safety. They have had to take precautions that would have seemed unthinkable just a few years ago. And all of this is a direct result of Trump's pattern of attacking anyone in the judicial system who rules against him. The self-sabotage dynamic is also worth exploring in depth because it reveals something essential about Trump's psychology. In every case where he has engaged in these outbursts, he has made his legal position worse. He has alienated the judges who will decide his fate. He has given prosecutors more ammunition to argue that he cannot be trusted to comply with court orders. He has created a record of behavior that will be cited against him in future proceedings. And he has done all of this despite having lawyers who are presumably telling him to stop. The self-destructive impulse is consistent and powerful. When Trump faces legal pressure, he cannot contain himself. He explodes. And the explosion always hurts him more than anyone else. This raises a fundamental question that has been debated by legal commentators and political analysts throughout Trump's legal saga. Is this a strategy or an inability? Is Trump deliberately trying to intimidate judges with his outbursts? Is he hoping that aggressive behavior will somehow produce better outcomes by making judges afraid to rule against him? Or is he simply unable to control himself in high-pressure situations, his temperament overwhelming any strategic calculation? The evidence increasingly points toward the second explanation. The pattern of explosions that cannot be stopped despite warnings from his own lawyers, despite clear consequences, despite everything, suggests someone who genuinely cannot control himself when the pressure mounts. Think about what it means that his own lawyers repeatedly tried to calm him down during the civil fraud outburst and failed. These are professionals paid to protect his interests. They understand that attacking a judge is disastrous for any legal case. They have every incentive to prevent these outbursts, and yet they could not get him to stop. That suggests something beyond strategy. That suggests genuine inability to regulate his own behavior in the courtroom environment. It suggests that when Trump is on the witness stand, when he feels under attack, when the pressure is most intense, he simply cannot help himself. He explodes. And the explosion becomes a self-inflicted wound that his lawyers can only watch in horror. The consequences of this behavior are accumulating across multiple cases. In the civil fraud case, Trump has been fined for his violations of the gag order. He has been threatened with more serious sanctions if the behavior continues. And the judge who delivered those sanctions, Justice Engoron, has been the target of Trump's attacks both inside and outside the courtroom. The fines were not just monetary penalties. They were signals that the court would not tolerate the behavior. And the warnings about more serious consequences, including potential jail time, were signals that the court's patience was wearing thin. Trump has tested that patience repeatedly, and each time the court has responded with escalating sanctions. The criminal cases pose even greater risks for Trump because the stakes are higher. In criminal proceedings, the judge has even more power over the defendant's fate. Sentencing decisions can determine whether someone spends years in prison or walks free. And Trump's behavior in those proceedings has been just as confrontational as in the civil cases. He has attacked judges, he has violated gag orders, he has done everything he can to turn the courtroom into a spectacle. And in doing so, he has made it more likely that those judges will be less sympathetic to his arguments, less inclined to give him the benefit of the doubt, more likely to impose the maximum sentences allowed by law. The political dimension of these meltdowns is also significant. Every time Trump explodes in court, it reinforces an image that is deeply damaging to his political standing. It makes him look like someone who cannot handle scrutiny. It makes him look like someone who cannot tell the truth under oath. It makes him look like someone who is afraid of accountability. For a figure who has built his entire political identity on strength and dominance, the courtroom meltdowns reveal a different reality. They reveal someone who falls apart when confronted with the rules of a system he cannot control. And that image sticks. Voters see these moments. They remember them. They factor them into their judgments about whether Trump is fit for office. The pattern of self-sabotage across Trump's legal cases is one of the most consistent features of his entire post-presidential saga. In the civil fraud case, his outbursts made a bad situation worse. In the criminal cases, the same behavior threatens to produce equally damaging outcomes. And in every instance, the pattern is the same. Trump explodes, the judge responds with sanctions, Trump's legal position deteriorates, and the cycle continues. This is not a one-time problem that can be fixed with better lawyers or smarter strategy. This is a fundamental feature of how Trump behaves when he faces legal accountability. And until that changes, his legal troubles will continue to be compounded by his own conduct. The broader significance of this pattern extends beyond Trump's individual cases. It speaks to something more fundamental about the relationship between presidential power and the rule of law. When a president attacks judges, when a president encourages harassment of the judiciary, when a president treats courtrooms as campaign stages, he is undermining one of the core pillars of democratic governance. The independence of the judiciary is essential to the functioning of a constitutional democracy. Judges must be able to decide cases based on the law, not based on fear of political retaliation. And when Trump attacks judges who rule against him, he is not just hurting his own cases. He is hurting the entire judicial system. The harassment of judges who ruled against Trump is particularly troubling because it shows how far the attacks can go. NBC and Reuters have documented that these judges have faced harassment and threats that have affected their daily lives. Some have changed routines to avoid predictable patterns that could make them targets. Some have had security upgrades at their homes and offices. Some have worried about their families. This is not how a healthy democracy operates. Judges should not have to fear for their safety because of how they rule in cases. They should not have to change their lives because of threats from supporters of a political figure. And when they do, something has gone deeply wrong with the political culture. Trump's response to legal pressure is part of a broader pattern of rejecting judicial authority. He has called judges biased, corrupt, and part of rigged systems. He has attacked them personally, questioned their motives, and suggested they are engaged in political persecution. He has done everything he can to delegitimize any court that rules against him. And this rejection of judicial authority is not just about the cases he has faced personally. It is about the broader principle of whether courts have the power to hold presidents accountable. Trump's attacks on judges are attacks on the entire judicial system. They are attacks on the idea that no one is above the law. The question of whether Trump's courtroom behavior is strategic or the result of genuine inability to control himself is not just an academic one. It matters for understanding what comes next. If the meltdowns are strategic, they represent a calculated attempt to intimidate judges and delegitimize proceedings. If they are the result of inability to control himself, they represent a psychological vulnerability that will continue to hurt his cases. The evidence increasingly suggests the latter explanation. The pattern of explosions that cannot be stopped, despite warnings from his own lawyers, despite clear consequences, despite everything points toward genuine inability to regulate his own behavior when the pressure is most intense. The catastrophic hearing pattern has become one of the defining features of Trump's legal saga. It has produced fines, gag orders, threats of jail for contempt, and worse judicial attitudes toward Trump in case after case. It has reinforced his image as someone who cannot handle scrutiny or tell the truth under oath. It has alienated the judges who will decide his fate, and it has made his legal situation worse, not better, every single time. This is self-sabotage on a grand scale, a pattern of behavior that consistently undermines his own interests. And it shows no signs of stopping. As the cases continue to proceed, the legal walls are closing in despite the meltdowns. Courts continue to function, judges continue to apply the law, and Trump's behavior continues to make his situation worse. The fines and gag orders are not just punishments. They are signals that the judicial system will not be intimidated. The threats of jail for contempt are not just warnings. They are indications of how far the courts are willing to go to maintain order. And the hardening judicial attitudes are not just temporary reactions. They are lasting consequences that will affect how Trump is treated in every future proceeding. The fundamental challenge for Trump is that the courts are not going to be intimidated. They are not going to be bullied. They are going to continue applying the law regardless of his attacks. And that means his only real option is to change his behavior. But the pattern suggests that he cannot do that. The explosions are not a choice. They are an inevitability. When the pressure mounts, when the stakes are highest, Trump loses control. And every time he does, he makes his situation worse. This is the trap he has constructed for himself. And there is no easy way out. The irony of Trump's courtroom behavior is that it is driven by the same impulses that have defined his entire political career. He attacks when he feels threatened. He lashes out when he is cornered. He refuses to accept any authority that challenges him. These impulses have served him well in politics, where aggression and defiance are often rewarded. But they are disastrous in court, where the rules are different, where the judge has real power, and where losing control produces immediate and lasting consequences. Trump cannot seem to adapt to this different environment. He brings the same approach to the courtroom that he brings to the rally stage, and it fails him every single time. The catastrophic hearings will continue as the cases proceed. Trump will continue to explode. Judges will continue to respond with sanctions, and Trump's legal position will continue to deteriorate. This is the pattern that has been established across multiple cases, and there is no reason to think it will change. The legal walls are closing in, despite the meltdowns, despite the attacks, despite everything Trump does to try to stop them. And in the end, the courts will decide his fate. Not his lawyers, not his supporters, not his attacks on judges, the courts. And the courts will not be intimidated by a pattern of behavior that has produced nothing but more consequences for the person engaging in it. This is the lesson of Trump's catastrophic hearings. The behavior makes things worse, not better. The explosions produce consequences, not results. The attacks on judges produce retaliation, not intimidation. And the self-sabotage continues because Trump cannot control himself when the pressure is highest. The pattern is established, the consequences are clear, and the legal walls are closing in despite everything. Trump's courtroom behavior will continue to be studied as a cautionary tale about what happens when someone who has never faced accountability is finally forced to confront it. The meltdowns reveal something essential about his character, and they have produced legal outcomes that will define his legacy. The catastrophic hearings where Trump goes nuts on judges are making his legal situation worse with every single explosion. And there is no end in sight.